Great to see you all. This is our last session of 2022. It is sort of stunning to believe that the year is over almost. I know a lot of you have a lot of work between now and December 31st. But today we're going to talk less about 2022 and more taking a minute, just a little breather here, to look ahead to 2023. Let's sort of indulge in this little time travel to understand where we're going. A couple of housekeeping notes that are going to feel familiar to you. Those of you who've been here for more than a couple of sessions, this is CFRE approved. Thank you to my colleague Amanda for making that happen. And at the end of the session, as you might know, we will drop a survey into the chat. And if you fill this out, we can make sure you get CFRE credits. So please do that. Here's the agenda for today. Pretty straightforward. What's going to happen? What are we looking at for the donors by different generations? So that will be fun. And then what do we do about it, right? So pretty straightforward. This might be a little shorter than some, we'll see. But wanted to make sure we have some time for questions and reflections. So intros, I know so many of you. My name is Patrick, co-founder, co-CEO of FreeWill, alongside my wonderful, wonderful co-founder, Jenny. And we get to work alongside an amazing team, 200 plus folks. I think maybe edging towards 7.5 billion raised, not sure. 1,000 wonderful nonprofit partners who we are delighted to work with. And this is the team. So a lot of, by the way, the research and other things happens from a lot of people on this team. And so I don't want to take too much credit for it. And then maybe last thing before we get started, we love to give gifts on these. We're so grateful you're here for an hour. This has been actually my favorite book of 2022. So it's a book called The Daily Stoic, 366, because there's, it's there for your leap year years, on wisdom, perseverance, and the art of living. I assume that some people on the call have actually read this as well. But I love it. It's a sort of daily 2-paragraph meditation on life from the Greek thinkers, as well as a bunch of modern sort of analysis of it. Super readable, super easy. And Jess says she loves it, and Ty has it as well. So we will send this to 20 folks. Make a note in the survey. Strong recommend to get it. Great way to start the day. All right, let's dive in here. So first, a couple of really good trends. You can hear my voice is as scratchy as everybody else's this season. So big shoots up on happiness, big downshift on anxiety. I don't know if people are just thrilled that holidays are here, but just like enormous shifts across the board. So really good things. We started out asking people if they were lonely when we were doing this during COVID. Obviously, a lot less lockdowns now. Actually, lowest recorded loneliness. So that's pretty cool. And then also, excuse me, we asked you how confident you are about hitting your goals this year, and we're starting to tick back up. So that's pretty exciting to see as well, right? Still a little bit down from when we were all starry-eyed young people in January, and we've gone through some ups and downs across the board, but good to see here. And then we ask you about how you're feeling about 2023. And boy, there's a lot going on here, right? So hopeful and excited and energized and determined and optimistic, which we love. Also things like nervous and concerned and anxious and overwhelmed, challenged, possibilities, opportunities, unprepared, right? So a lot of people said unprepared. Some of you said tired. I'm already tired about 2023. But a lot of you also said innovative and new and eager and confident and creative. So I, for one, am looking forward to the new calendar year with all of you, and I think we will learn a ton. So let's do a little, we can put on our little time traveler jackets and really look at what we expect to happen in 2023, and then we'll talk about what to do about all of this. So first things first, as always, we have recurring elections in the United States, and there's going to be some impact from the elections that just happened and some impact from the elections yet to come. So historically, right, we've shared this in previous sessions, nonprofits that are aligned, meaning ideologically so, right? We're not talking about formal alliances, with the losing party see a sharp increase in giving after an election, especially if the result was a surprise. So after the 2016 election of President Donald Trump, you saw huge spikes in giving to the ACLU, to Planned Parenthood, to Anti-Defamation League, things like that. After the early election of President Obama and then the re-election in 2012, you saw increased giving to conservative organizations. And oftentimes what happens is you see a slight decrease, right, when your party actually wins, sort of this bizarre reversal of fortunes. Your fundraising is inversely correlated to how well the sort of macro environment is for your crew. So what happened in 2020? Well, first, despite some polling predictions, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for this that we could spend 2 hours on, but we will not, the red wave did not fully materialize. And we ended up with what people are calling a split decision, right? So you all know this. Democrats now hold a 51-49 majority in the Senate, depending on how you count Miss Sinema, and Republicans won the House by a relatively narrow margin and are now about to embark in a particularly interesting speaker election. Because we have this split decision, we're likely to see no huge spike in increases or decreases for nonprofits on either side of the political spectrum, right? So sort of netted out to a neutral effect here, whereas a huge Republican wave and Republicans taking over the Senate would have meant an increase in giving to more progressive organizations. Had the red wave really failed to materialize and Democrats kept the House, you might have seen more giving to conservative organizations. We also see, right now we have split power, not just split results. And so, we're not going to see a huge shift in tax rules that you might have seen, in particularly a fully Democratic control environment. So I hope that makes sense. Also, boy, we just had a second to get used to the 2022 midterms. We're only a week away from the last Senate election in Georgia, and we are already looking ahead for the 2024 presidential, right? So we should expect regular announcements from candidates from January to June. And some, like former President Trump, have already declared. Fun fact here, hundreds of people have already declared for president. We just haven't heard of most of them, right? Most of them are sort of lesser known folks with very little shot, but hundreds of people, when I went to go look, have already declared for both Democrats and Republicans, as well as a whole bunch of independents. What does this mean? It means that as Republican primary ramps up, starting very soon after the new year, your conservative donors are likely to be at least somewhat distracted for much of the second half of the year, if not even earlier. And now the Democratic side is a bit of a conundrum, right? President Biden has said he will decide early next year whether to run. And if he does run, you have a relatively quiet period among your more progressive donors for quite a long time until the general election really ramps up, which is probably about the beginning of 2023, if not later. But if he doesn't run, suddenly you're going to have a huge amount of energy on the left, sort of jostling for new candidates. There's not, some people might say that Vice President Harris is a sort of clear frontrunner, but it is also likely the case that many other people will jump in. Therefore, you're going to have a ton of energy sucked out of the room for your progressive donors by this process, if it happens. So we'll know January, February, March, no clear date yet, but we'll keep an eye on this. All right, so that's one big trend happening, right? So you still see the after effects of the election and the forward-looking effects of the election yet to come. The second massive trend, and we think this is really the most important trend of the decade, is the great wealth transfer is really beginning to start in earnest, right? So you're going to start to see those trickles this year. Over the next 2 decades, $70 trillion is going to be passed on from wealthy older generations, particularly the baby boomers. We'll talk more about boomers in a second. Gen X and millennials are going to be the primary recipients of this, but the estimates to charity are also considerable, right? So millennials in 8 years, 7 years starting January, will have 5 times more wealth than they have right now, right? So they will start to become more philanthropic powerhouses. Where that wealth is going, right, between Gen X, between millennials, between other boomers, and between charities, those decisions are happening right now, right? And those distributions are going to start very soon. You can tell this, right? We talk about the great wealth transfer and people sort of get it generally, but it's worth taking a hard look at this, right? So look at how different the sizes of the generations are, right? We often forget that, boy, there's a lot more 60-year-olds than there are 50-year-olds in America right now, right? You wouldn't have thought that. 76 million births in the boomers, 62 million births in millennials, 55 million in Gen X, 47 million in the silent generation, right? So, I mean, pretty remarkable, right? Look at particularly that silent generation compared to the boomer generation. So if you did planned giving for the last 10 years, you basically did the worst 10 years of giving in planned giving of the last few decades, and you're going into some of the best decades for planned giving, right? And people forget how small that preceding generation was. It is tiny. And so this is a really interesting view, right? Massive potential for nonprofits. Some estimates are up to $12 trillion. We believe this to be an aggressive estimate, but still worth paying attention to. Older donors are going to leave considerable gifts in their estate plans. People forget that the average bequest is 3 times the entire lifetime giving of an individual. So that's super important. And then, as I mentioned earlier, younger donors now with their newfound wealth are going to become more philanthropic. So that's 2, right? So our first thing, elections, all sorts of effects. Second, great wealth transfer, money shifting to millennials, and hopefully really driving planned giving to a greater degree. Third, right, we may be heading towards a recession. A recession is a significant decline in economic activity that lasts for months or years. A common definition, right? Recession is not an official term, but sort of the commonly agreed upon definition by a lot of economists, 2 or more consecutive quarters of declining national GDP. It is an unavoidable part of the business cycle. Those of you that are older than, say, 14, which is going to be most of you, have experienced at least one recession in your life. Those of you that are older than, call it 23, 24, have experienced at least 2. Some of you have experienced a half dozen or more. Over the past 30 years, the US has gone through 4 different recessions. So we know, right, because we can look at past data, we know what likely outcomes are to be for giving. So giving goes down in recessions, not hugely, right? Annually, it's gone down, so it's gone up about 3.3%. During good years, we're going up 5%. During down years, it decreases by about 0.5%, right? So that's pretty good, right? We'll take that, right? We'll take that overall growth across the board. And why is this? Well, during a recession, Americans focus on other things, right? They feel more stretched for their own essentials, and they feel less abundant, and they give less, right? Impacts on the stock market, specifically for a bunch of tax reasons, and because how people feel often highly correlate with giving. So let's take a look at this, right? You have some ups years and some down years, but the biggest decrease, right, in charitable, in individual giving happens in severe recessions. 2008, 2009, 2001, after the dot-com crash, 1990. I was not that old. I actually don't have a great insight into what happened in the 90s recession, but if anyone wants to add that to the chat, do so. And you can see some other years of slight down. 2018, actually a relatively bad year for the stock market. People forget that. But across the board, you see generally good signs here. Excuse me. So during a recession, right, it could be bad news, but they also prioritize what's important to them. So in 2008, 2009, which is by far the worst year for giving on record, giving dropped by 15%. But giving to things like food banks, social services went up by 10%. So what we're seeing here is that struggles and recessions are not predetermined. And it really becomes important to understand what donor motivations are. They go beyond values, they go beyond finances, towards personal values. And people are really willing to give in moments of need when we can articulate why it's especially important to give now. We'll talk more about that in a second. We also see that what happens is percent of income given to charity is fairly consistent, right? So they spend most of their money on housing, transport, food. In recessions, we don't shift around a lot. We just do a little bit less in each category, including charitable giving. So average income donated to charity goes between 3 and 5% of income, but it stays pretty static. There's just less income going around and less wealth going around during a recession, right? So that's why this happens. We also know that not all donors are impacted the same, right? And so economic shocks are often felt very differently based on things like race, age, gender, geographic location, type of work, right? Households more strongly affected by the Great Recession, which is what we call that 08-09 number, experience a slower recovery, larger declines in charitable giving. And when we look at this, right, we also have this sort of interesting dynamic where inflation is happening, which was not quite so true in 08 and 09, right? Here's what inflation looks like over the last, call it 8 or 9 years. And you can see, wow, things have really shot up since 2021. Why is that happening? Right, it rose the most in Q1 to Q2, still increasing, started to slow in Q3. We just got reports this morning of new analysis that inflation is a little bit slower than expected. So the stock market was up a couple points based on the news. We can talk more about this in a future session because it happened literally 3 hours ago. And yet that's very positive for the economy. So it could be that things are going to be looking up to a greater degree than was expected. But what we saw historically this year, housing, gasoline, energy, food have gone up a lot in terms of expenses. Healthcare costs actually mercifully have stayed pretty low. And the Federal Reserve is saying, great, we're gonna raise some interest rates to fight this. Many of you know this stuff, but it's worth at least recounting. This makes it more expensive to borrow, right? So now it's harder to borrow, less likely to spend, right? It actually costs more to spend money that you're gonna borrow against. And so we see overall consumer spending slow as a way to tamp down inflation. Deirdre, thank you very much. Deirdre says the recession in the 90s was oil prices, potentially in part by the Gulf War, and weird responses from the feds. Thank you, really appreciate that. When we look at inflation and how it affects philanthropy, there are a couple of things that we need to think about. One, it doesn't really cut the impulse to give, but the type or the gift of amount might be affected. More importantly, the $100 you got last year is worth less today, right? Because your things cost more. And so you may need to raise more just to be able to have the same impact. Particularly in cash, this is quite a challenge. And the challenge here is that, you may see people pull back as inflation, and instead of sort of, cutting their giving across the board, they may be narrowing it. So it's really important to be grabbing those donors who may be quite close to you. So that's the third trend, right? So we talked about the elections, we talked about the great wealth transfer, we talked about recession. The fourth thing, and many of you are feeling this pretty acutely as well, is that donor advised funds are eating the world of philanthropy, right? And some of you have seen this, but the numbers are pretty astounding, right? So before we get to that, let's all just recap what DAFs are. We'll call them DAFs, short for donor advised funds. By far the fastest growing giving vehicle of the last 10 years. Donors put money into an investment fund with a sponsoring organization, sort of a middleman charity, and then recommend grants out at a later point. We get an immediate tax benefit, even if the money doesn't go to you for 2 decades. Money is usually invested in this account, mostly in mutual funds, so the fund grows over time. Donors routinely donate cash, but they also, and this is the big point, give stocks, publicly traded securities, mutual funds, non-public assets, right? If you are Schwab or Fidelity's charitable gift fund, 2/3 of the stuff you're getting and the value of all of it is not cash, right? So that is a really important point. Many DAF sponsors require a minimum. Sometimes it's 5,000, sometimes it's 25,000. But actually the 2 biggest, Schwab and Vanguard, now have 0 minimums. So you're starting to see more and more people engage here. Let's talk about how fast these are growing, because people think they're growing fast and they're growing even faster than you think. In 2021, right? So not even counting the last 12 months, where all these numbers are going to be about higher than they are in 21. $45 billion came from DAFs to charities, up almost 30% from the previous year. Again, 30% growth year over year is wild in a year where giving is only going up 3 or 4%. 45 billion also represents a pretty enormous, more than 1/8 of all the individual giving that's happening. I mean, this is just astounding. You can see here in this graph to the right that this is more than doubled where we were, 4 years ago. It's almost double where we were just 3 years ago. So it's pretty just astonishing across the board. Now, what else do we know? When we look at the future, we got a little crystal ball here, because we know how much money went into DAFs last year in 21. $72 billion was contributed to DAFs in 2021. This is astonishing, and nearly 50% increase year over year. Why does that matter? Well, that's a whole bunch of money, But when we see increases in donor advised fund giving into the DAFs, what that predicts is more giving out of the DAFs a year, 2 or 3 years later. So when we look at that 46 number, we think, wow, that's a lot. That will seem small next year when we compare it to 2022 giving and 2023 giving, right? You can see this accelerating growth, which will continue. There was a total of $234 billion in assets at the end of 2021. $234 billion, equivalent to about half of all charitable giving in the United States. This is remarkable, right? This is, we really think about what are the massive trends of the decades, of the next decade in philanthropy. 1, great wealth transfer. 2, DAFs eating the world. 3, the rise of millennials, right? These are the big things that should be shaping your decade-long strategy. There are now 1.3 million DAFs in the US. That, I believe, is a 20% increase. In a future session, probably in January, we're going to spend a whole hour on donor advised funds, because this is such an important story, and it's really going to shape your entire strategy for, not just 2023, but the next 5 years. So those are some of the big trends. Now let's sort of go check in on our donors age by age, because each bracket is behaving a little bit differently, and different things are happening in their world that's causing this. So when we look at generations, it's important, I sort of told everyone, let's not think about, this being a flat number, right? So greatest generation, bless them, born before 1928, almost entirely gone, right? So 0.3% of the population is in the greatest generation. Those folks are, what's the math here? Turning 95 or older in 2023, right? So not a lot of folks around still. Silent generation, also, much smaller than people think, right? These are folks born up to 1945, right? So these are folks 78 and older, only 6% of the population. I mean, look at the drop off between boomers and silent. Now, part of this is that silent generation older, many of them have passed away. A lot of it is that many of them were not born in the first place, right? So this is a really important point. We go look at boomers, and they're still just got passed by millennials. An enormous population. 20%, 21%, excuse me, significantly more than Gen X, more than Gen Z as well, right? So pretty wild. Now, some of you will be discerning and say, well, some of these generations have an extra year or two on the others. That's true, but it's still worth noting how large these populations are. So let's check in on boomers first, and we'll go down the line and get to younger donors as well. So our boomers, right? Some of you are in this category. You should be proud. Great generation, born between 46 and 64. They are almost done with their 50s as an entire generation. And the oldest ones are turning 77 in 2023, right? So big shift. 70 million folks in the US, 21% of the US population in 2021. What do they do in their lives? Well, 10,000 of them are turning 70 every single day. We'll talk about why that's important in a second. Many are retired or becoming grandparents. Many of them are grandparents. The oldest ones are close to the average life expectancy of 77 years. Right? Really, really, really important. When we look at the wealth that's happening here, they are still by far the wealthiest generation. I mean, look at this wealth division. Look at that bottom right corner, navy blue, right? One of my favorite FreeWill colors is the wealth that boomers have. 53%. If you are not going to boomers and asking for money, you are not trying as an organization, because this is where all of the wealth sits. You can see millennials, 5 trillion. That is going to grow very quickly. Gen X, 29, silent generation and older, some there, but boomers have all the wealth in America. They make up 41% of all donations, 55% of all high net worth donors. And as they're getting older, right, this is what's pushing the great wealth transfer. And so we'll talk more about that in a moment, but it's really important to sort of, when we talk about the great wealth transfer, it's because half of the wealth in the United States is about to be sent somewhere over the next 2 decades. And this is just of historic proportions that I think even the folks that pay a lot of attention to it aren't quite ready for. When we think about these folks, right, what are we keeping in mind? Well, one is these folks are wildly tech savvy compared to the preceding generations, right? 2/3 of them prefer to give online. only less than 20% prefer to send a check in the mail, right? Many are on fixed incomes and budgets because they're no longer working, so inflation is going to have a greater impact. Many, and this is really important for you all, 70 plus are newly eligible for what we call QCDs, or qualified charitable distributions. Giving a QCD is better than cash because it helps you meet required minimum distributions and saves you on income taxes, whether or not you're itemizing deductions. So a whole generation is sort of aging into this type of giving. And this is also, along with DAFs, one of the fastest types of growth, right? They're much better for you because they result in bigger gifts from your donors. They're better for your donors because they give them tax savings no matter what. So this ends up being really useful. Let's do a quick visit with Gen X. So between 43 and 58, 2023, 65 million of these folks, 20% of the population, a little bit smaller than the bookended generations they have. They have fewer children and lower marriage rates than boomers. So those of you with children know that children cost a lot of money. And so some of them are going to have more disposable income. Where are they at in their lives? Well, very few are retired, but they might be thinking about it. Most are still working, and they're in the middle of big life transitions. They're getting older, they're paying off debt, they're accumulating wealth. They're also making the most money they're going to make in their careers for the most part. So how do we think about Gen X in 2023? Well, a couple things, right? One is, this is your crew for matching donations. Why is that? They are all working, and they are making the most money of the working population, right? So there are very strong avenues for matching gifts here, and they're deep into their wealth accumulating years, right? So they actually own a lot more crypto than baby boomers. They own a lot of stock, more than millennials. They're opening donor advised funds. They're putting money there. And this is, they're really tech savvy. So they're looking for these things online. 38% of Gen X own stock. They own 26% of the market, second only to boomers. That's a lot of money, right? We're talking trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in stock. And they don't want to be boomers. And so they're really put off by outdated websites, right? They view themselves as young, even though some of them are approaching their late 50s. And it's very important to them that you look and feel tech savvy, right? So a lot of them are only going to donate online. A lot of them, even on the major giving side and the non-cash side, are only going to do this online. So that's a really important shift. Dean asks, when I say stock, do you mean individual stocks or mutual funds and ETFs? The answer is yes. All of those three things count. Dean, thank you for that question. Kelly also asks, do QCDs only happen at the end of the year? What's the timing? Kelly, you have to fulfill those gifts at some point during the calendar year, right? So the government says you have to take X amount of money out of your IRA every year once you hit a certain age, and that has to happen by December 31st. So a lot of people do it in January because they're proactive. A lot of people do it in April around tax season. A lot of people do it at end of year because they're procrastinators. So all of those options are on the table. All right, let's check in on millennials. Proud millennial myself, born from 81 to 96. They're between 27 and 42 right now, or at least next year. There's 72 million millennials. We are now the biggest generation in the United States. So that's cool for what it is. And where are they at in their lives? Well, they're moving into a higher income bracket, right? Those folks are hitting 38, 40, making a lot more money than they were 15 years ago. As a reminder, this is the most educated generation of the ones we've talked about. And so for many, their incomes are significantly higher than their peers were at the same age. They might be caring for aging parents. They're also beginning to gain wealth through inheritance, right? So if you are 42, it's totally plausible that your parents are 75, 76, 77 or younger, right? And so many of these folks are beginning to inherit wealth. Remember, this is really important. Millennial wealth is expected to grow by 5x by 2030. So you're seeing huge shifts in wealth. Remember that giant bottom half of the wealth, right? All that navy blue is moving towards millennials as well as charity. More than half of millennials still do not own a home, either rent or live with friends and family. And so that's another element here. You also see increased urbanization of millennials to a greater degree than other folks. By the way, Cindy asked, where do we get our data from? When you go through the deck, you'll actually see sources and footnotes. So it's a lot of different sources, including some of our own research. Great question. So what do we think about when we think about millennials in 2023? Well, first is we're trying to welcome them into philanthropy, right? These are people who are rising donors who are going to have significantly increased wealth, even if they don't inherit anything, right? Because their incomes are going up and up and up. And so for things like your leadership circles, your giving circles of recognition, having a lower threshold for those under 45 or under 40, where you might say, 50,000 and up joins the president's circle. Well, if you're under 40, maybe it's 10,000. And we get people in that habit. And then by the time they're of that age, they're shifting up to 50. Consider lowering the threshold for things like named scholarships in the same way, right? We really want to introduce these people to major giving, even at a lower level, because they make less now, but they're going up and up and up and up. You want to invite people to endow a chair, create a scholarship, or sponsor a park bench with friends and not just spouses. Remember, this population is way less married than your boomers. And so they do a lot of things in friend cohorts. So you might have 3 college graduates teaming up together to endow a chair. Whereas in your older generations, it's really sort of a, 2 spouses or something like that, right? So there's another difference here and a pretty cool avenue. Christine asks, what are ages for millennials? 27 to 42 next year. Great question. All right, so let's check in on Gen Z. These folks are 11 to 26 in 2023. These are not your priority. 68 million folks, 20% of the population, way more racially, ethnically, and sexual orientation diverse than any other generation. The first truly digital native generation. Don't remember life before cell phones, right? Don't remember life before the internet. No experience of it compared to millennials. And they're still too young to be on your fundraising radar. So we want to acknowledge that these people exist. Do not stress about them from a fundraising strategy. You will have plenty of time in 15 years to put a big focus on them. Remember, they're also a smaller generation than millennials. So millennials are going to be one of your core demographics for quite a long time. All right, so we've talked about some of the major trends. We've talked about generations, what to do about it. Let's go back to some of these major trends and talk about what are the strategies we're going to put in place. So first, we're going to be thoughtful about the 2024 election, right? So organizations on either side of the political spectrum, as I mentioned, are not going to see massive shifts from the midterms, right? But our conservative donors are about to be routinely solicited by a lot of different presidential campaigns in a very short amount of time. So if you know folks in your group, right, either you're a conservative organization and everyone's in this group, or you're a museum and you have big folks across the spectrum, right? Think about front loading your asks in 2023 before they start getting hit up repeatedly by different primary candidates. If you are a more progressive group and you start to hear rumblings of Joe Biden not running for a second term, you are going to have the same experience, and you need to start considering front running some of your asks as well. So that's really important. Also remember that donors with the earliest primaries and caucuses will start getting deluged with messages. I mean, just unbelievable level of saturation by the end of the year, right? So some of you who are historically, I don't know if any of you on the call are from Iowa or New Hampshire, but you can maybe attest to what it's like to be an Iowan or New Hampshireite in December of a presidential year. South Carolina as well, says Caitlin. So for Republicans, we haven't finalized we meaning America, hasn't finalized the calendar yet, but Iowa and New Hampshire are likely to remain the first states there. Republicans just reiterated their commitment to Iowa. This is in sharp contrast to Democrats, for whom Iowa is now an afterthought compared to the primacy it's had for, 40, 50 years. South Carolina, New Hampshire, Nevada, Georgia, and Michigan, right? These are your February primary states, which means these are the states that are going to get blanketed by the end of the year, right? So if your organization just runs out of these places, think about how we push up some of the calendar. And if you have a lot of donors in these places, think about how we make sure we're asking them before the end of the year as well. All right, strategy 2. We are going into either a recession or potentially a perceived recession, which basically is going to have a lot of the same psychological effects. So what we do about this is that we start framing our gifts that are tax smart or smarter ways to give, more impact, less cost. Because not only are people thinking about a recession, if you go watch TV or listen to the radio, and I encourage you to do so over the next few days, listen to the commercials with a more critical ear. And what you will often hear is people start with pickup trucks. They used to say Dodge Ram is the coolest truck ever. They say, welcome to our inflation busting cash back event, right? Now is the time for savings. And they're basically encouraging you to buy a new pickup truck under the lens of saving money. And these messages are really inundating all of our donors and most of the American population. Therefore, this is going to be on the mind of folks across the board, right? Promoting things like appreciated assets giving, mostly stock, sometimes crypto, because these gifts avoid all of their capital gains taxes, right? You say, would you like to avoid all capital gains taxes this year and get a full income tax deduction? Think about giving us stock, right? It's a smarter way to give that a lot of people are using to have more impact at less cost, right? This is the kind of messaging that resonates, particularly in a year like this. And then as cash becomes less valuable with inflation, we should be actively shifting donors towards some of these non-cash gifts, especially folks with what we call low anchor points, right? If you remember the old cartoons where grandpa would say, here's a nickel. I think there was like an A&W root beer commercial that I might be a little too young for, where it'd say, can I go to the movies? And here's a quarter, right? And the kid says a quarter, and grandpa says, get some popcorn too. And the lesson here is that basically donors who spend most of their lives when $100 bought a lot more than it does now are still anchored towards these lower gift values. And we need to be able to shift asset types and gift types as a way to get them out of this. In tight times, right, we want to be reminding donors of their wealth, right? So asset gifts remind us of our wealth. And there was an experiment run that I've shared with some of you before, right? So grad students sat outside a grocery store in Boston, and they asked shoppers coming in, what's in your wallet? Cash, credit cards? And then they asked a different group, do you own stocks? Do you own bonds? And regardless of the answer, right? People just sort of share what they had. The shoppers who were asked about stocks and bonds ended up spending way more at the market, right? Which is pretty exciting. Our friend, Dr. Russell James, did this research. It's pretty cool. So when we think about anchor points, this is really important, right? So when I ask you for a donation, right? The Nature Conservancy, we all love, right? So really important stuff. You might think, how much does it cost me if I ask you for $10,000? Or I might say, with a $10,000 gift, you can be saving $2,000 in taxes. And now we're anchoring on savings or what impact am I having, right? With a $10,000 gift, you can actually save, 40 acres of wilderness. And suddenly that feels like a bargain, right? We want to stay away from the first one as much as possible. Help the donor focus on the second or the third or both. Now let's look at some examples here, right? This is always, always, always true. It is more important during a recession when people are especially cost conscious. So a couple of examples. Can you give $10,000 this year to the land trust, right? That is an anchor on cost. And when I ask you that, what are you thinking, right? Maybe just put yourself in those shoes for now. What you're thinking is, wow, 10,000 is a lot. That's like, I don't know, 6 months of grocery expenses. It might be, 2 months of nursery school tuition. I'm not sure what nursery school costs these days. Things like this, right? So you're comparing it to other things you're spending money on. Now, I could also say, did you know that by giving $10,000 in appreciated stock, you might be able to save more than $5,000 in taxes this year, right? Because we're avoiding capital gains and getting that full deduction. Now we're anchoring on savings, and suddenly, wow, saving $5,000 is pretty exciting. I'm not as anchored on that cost, right? Third one is, with a $10,000 gift of appreciated stock, you can help us finally open the path through the preserve. This will give thousands of families a chance to experience nature in a new way next year. And now suddenly, for $10,000, I'm helping thousands of families have a pretty significant experience in my mind. That sounds like a bargain. Now we're sort of, at the clearance rack at Marshall's. That feels like a great deal, compared to that first one. So all of these are asking the same, but each of this is going to have vastly different impacts. And by the way, the third one doesn't cost you any more to say than the first one. The second one doesn't cost you any more than the first one. You can put in the same effort and have much better results. All right, so that's our second strategy. Third strategy, it is really important that if you are a serious fundraising team, that we're going big on planned giving in anticipation of the great wealth transfer, right? This giving type is already $40 billion a year, and we haven't really started the great wealth transfer yet. Also, in the immediate term, these gifts identify your most loyal supporters, And people who make a planned gift increase their real-time giving by 3/4 in following years. Also in a recession, it's a really, really good time because these gifts don't cost anyone today. And so they can be more attractive to people who say, oh, I really want to help, but I can't do so right now. If your team is serious about thriving the next 10 years and the next 20 years, we need to make sure there's sufficient investment in planned giving, right? This is really, really important. Strategy 4, we need to accept, people have all sorts of hemming and hawing about donor advised funds. It's totally justified. We also know that it's happening and it's real, right? So our hemming and hawing doesn't raise money. We need to adjust to our new reality with donor advisements. DAFs should be an option every time you send donation asks. A gift from my donor advised fund should be an option on your donate page, right? Where all that millennial and Gen X, even younger boomers are all giving that way. You want a checkbox. I have a donor advised fund. I want to learn more about giving this way. And in every survey you send, excuse me, we need a question about, do you have a donor advised fund? When you're talking to major donors, in these one-on-one conversations over coffee, in the living room, whatever, say something like, many of our supporters give out of a donor advised fund. Would you like information on how other people are using their DAFs to have a big impact? People might say, oh, I don't have a DAF. Great, no problem, that's great information. Oh, I do, what else? We set that up 2 years ago. Remember, these are as new to donors as they are to you. We set that up 2 years ago, we'd love to hear more, right? People don't know you can set recurring gifts from your DAF. People don't know you can have beneficiary designations from your DAFs, right? These are all super, super important. Many nonprofits that we talk to are automatically assigning a gift officer to anyone with a donor advised fund. This is especially true during a recession because this money has all been pre-given. Remember when I told you people were sort of, scared and thrifty with recession and inflation? Well, that money is already gone. And so this is a really good moment to say, lean in with your donor advised fund donors and say, can you give a little bit more? We're seeing other people maybe give less. We really need you to step up to do this really important impact thing. And then strategy 5, as we think about sort of battling inflation and shifting the way people are giving, it's super important that you have these options as much as possible on your donate page. So our friends at SPLC, they have crypto, they have stock giving, they have qualified charitable distributions out of your IRA, all this on your donate page, and they are likely to do much better because they've done this, right? So this is super important. All right, so that wraps up some of the core components here. A couple of reminders, and potentially my colleague Amanda can drop the survey link in the chat right now if you don't mind doing that, Amanda. But we would love to send you this gift. So the Daily Stoic, I read it, I would love to say every day, but probably 250 days a year, and it's really wonderful. So strong recommend. If you hate it, you can give it to someone else as a gift next Christmas or Hanukkah. Please, by the way, do not say yes to this if you're not including an address, because we want to send it to you, not just know it. All right. Other resources we're going to send your way following up. Please just make a quick note in the survey so we can send these to you. A guide to donor advised funds. We think this is the most important giving type of the next 10 years, along with planned giving. Help figure that out. And a guide to how to write effective emails, especially during recession, right? So these are all here for you. If you are interested at some point, we are a really good fit for organizations more than 1 million in contributions, or at least 5,000 annual supporters. We are also beginning to open up to smaller organizations as well. And so if that's you, feel free to add your name. Would love to talk to you as well. We have a lot of best-in-class tools around plan giving, around giving out of your IRA, around stock giving, around crypto. We are also developing some new tools around donor advised funds. So feel free to make a note in the survey if you want to hear more when those come out, hopefully pretty soon. So yes. And with that, one actually final note is that we're so excited to partner with many of you. If you're not a partner and you're interested, we're also doing one-on-one strategy sessions with me. In case I was appealing, it may not be at all appealing to some of you, for folks that are joining in December. So feel free to get on board with that if you're interested. All right, so let's dive into some questions, and then we will, if you all can take a minute to fill out that survey, that would be so wonderful. And I will I will take a quick look at the questions. All right, so Caitlin says, have you taken into account the wealth transferring, the great wealth transfer being lower than expected because of the rise of end-of-life care? Carrie asks, where is the survey? Carrie, it's in the chat, so I'm just going to repaste it here. Thanks for that question. Oops. Okay, she says she hasn't. Here it is one more time. Thank you for asking there. Have you taken into account the great wealth transfer being lower than expected because of the rise of end-of-life care? Caitlin, a lot of the analysis that we see already takes this into account. One thing to know is that healthcare has actually been relatively lighter on inflation than other components lately. So that's really interesting. Another thing is that while it's growing, assets and stocks and housing values are also growing. So these things are all sort of going up together. So good question. Deirdre asks, what is the impact of not having direct contact with donors? Deirdre, I assume you mean from donor advised funds. I mean, you all know that not stewarding donors is a great way to lose them. And this is one of the biggest challenges about being disintermediated by donor advised funds. We think there are some specific solutions to make sure you're getting all the donor information, that you're actively engaging with these folks. Most people who have DAFs are not doing so because they want to be anonymous. They're doing so because their financial advisor has encouraged them to use this as a tax efficient way to give, right? They are not trying to hide from you, right? They would love to be engaged. They would love to be thanked. They would love to be taken on tours of your hospital, museum, school, nature conservancy, whatever it is, right? And so we really need to put in place some best-in-class strategies to make sure we're engaging with these people, that we're identifying with them, that we're thanking them. And we'll talk a lot more about that at a future session. Kelly asks about QCDs. We did answer that already. Stacy says, are we meant to target, when we ask for money, the baby boomers or their heirs? And the answer is yes, both of these folks, right? So baby boomers, many of them will be alive for a long time, right? So we can't ignore them. As we mentioned earlier, they have half of the wealth in the United States, right? So if you're not asking boomers for real-time gifts, we are not even trying. We also need to be asking about planned gifts, because that real-time gift is going to be about 1/10,000th of a bequest, or 1/1000th, right? A couple of bequests a year are going to be transformative for smaller organizations, and dozens of bequests per year are going to be transformative for larger organizations. And so it's really important that we're doing both of these. We also need to be prepping for a world where millennials are getting more and more of the wealth in America, right? Both from increased income and inheritance, which is obviously a pretty big area. Alex says, for younger donors, millennial and Gen Z, any suggestions on how to tap into their inclination for philanthropic but non-charitable gifts, like GoFundMe campaigns? This is really interesting, right? So Gen Z does not have a lot of money. So if you're going to focus on this, say focus mostly on millennials. We do see some charities do things like, really these sort of more authentic, grassrootsy GoFundMe campaigns, and sometimes they take off and sometimes they don't, right? But it's worth at least trying. The important thing to know about millennials is they do like being engaged, right? They respond really well to text, they respond well to personal things more than mass marketing. And they're very impact and issue driven more than organization driven, right? So you think about the greatest generation and the silent generation, they would really sign up for an institution and say, I am a donor to this institution. And we start to see in baby boomers, Gen X, and really culminating in millennials, they say, I really care about the cause. I care about the environment. I care about health research. I care about education, right? I care about, human rights. And they're less attached to an institution. So instead of leading with how great your institution is, make sure we're leading with the thing you're actually doing with money. And that tends to be much more effective for millennials. Maybe we'll do one more question and then we'll wrap up. Karen says, I have been told as a fundraiser to not give tax advice, although I love the connection of making, I love the idea of making the connection for donors. There are specific tax savvy ways to give. I don't feel qualified to state what they could be. Karen, I don't think you need to give hyper-specific tax advice, but I really want to encourage you to help your donors think about what might be available to them, right? So you don't have to promise this will be the tax savings. But all of your direct mail, all of your fundraising has historically said, make a tax deductible gift, right? So we're already engaging in this. And all we're saying is with crypto or stock or things like that, you're actually going to get twice the deductions. You're going to avoid your capital gains taxes, and you're going to get a full deduction as well. And so this is a really, I think people are too skittish around this. You're not going to do their taxes for them. And you don't have to promise any particular amount, but you say, it's possible you could be saving thousands this way. A lot of other people are doing this to save on their taxes. And yet, you're not an actuary, you don't pretend to be. But it is important that we're highlighting this as well. All right, so let's pause there. Thank you all. If you haven't already, please take that survey. Our next webinar is on January 10th. We are still finalizing topics. I think it is likely to be on donor advised funds as we dive in, right? I mean, this is just, there's sort of a lot more research and some pretty revelatory findings. So we really hope you can join for that. Before we go, I just want to say that this is the last session of this in 2022. I think we have done about 25, maybe 20, hard to count. But a huge thank you for showing up, for learning together. A lot of you who are FreeWill partners, we've discovered this stuff together, experimenting together. We've loved working alongside you. I know there's some FreeWill teammates on the call, and it's just been such an honor to sort of spend the year with you. But this has been a hard year for a lot of folks. Right? I mean, sort of really, March was sort of everything was going well, coming out of COVID, to some degree. And then the economy really tanked. The war in Ukraine really hit hard, both obviously the physical toll and certainly the economic toll as well. And I've really been impressed with the creativity, the thoughtfulness, the interest in learning and sort of navigating challenging waters this year. And so it's just been such a joy. So happy holidays, happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and can't wait to see you all next year.